Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to start talking about chapter 9 on lifespan development. And when we talk about development, oftentimes we think of kids and babies, but really in psychology we cover the whole lifespan, so from birth to death. So we're going to try to cover a lot of this information. This is a huge amount of information to try and cover in this chapter, and I did leave out several of the things that they covered in the book, so they will not be on the quiz. So physical development, I'm going to cover a tiny bit here, but I'm not going to ask you about fine motor skills and gross motor skills. If you really find this stuff fascinating, I'd highly recommend taking developmental psychology, which is Psych 240, and then we will really go into depth over a lot of these things. So we're kind of just going to skim over the surface of a lot of the information in developmental disability. So you don't need to know a lot about physical development. I'm not going to cover prenatal development. I'm not going to cover Freud's psychosexual theory. We'll cover a little bit about that in chapter 11 on personality. And then I'm also not going to cover Kohlberg's moral development. It's not that it's not important, it's just it's too much to cover. So I picked those things to not cover. So when we talk about development, we talk about changes in physical development, but also cognitive development, like your physical, your thought, your thinking ability. I can't think today. My cognitive ability is not working well, but your ability to think, how does that change throughout childhood, throughout adolescence, throughout adulthood? Do we have declines in adulthood? And then what about your psychosocial functioning? How does your interactions change? Little kids, I think, interact differently than adults, than adolescents. How do all of those things change over the lifespan? So we're going to cover a lot of this stuff, and we're going to cover a lot of the theories about development. So when we talk about lifespan human development, we're talking about development beginning at conception and then ending at death. And we will talk a little bit about death and dying in the very last video. Developmental psychology studies all these changes across the lifespan. So this is what I'm going to talk about real briefly about normal physical development. So, if you're familiar with babies, I know some of you have children already, so you're going to be pretty familiar with this kind of stuff. And if you're not, and even if you are a parent, some of these things might not be fresh in your memory. So there is a huge range actually of normal. So we normally think of a child walking around a year old, but there's, a wide range here. It says walking well here goes from 11 months all the way up until about 14 and a half months. So, if you're at that 15-month stage and you're not walking, there might be a concern. That's one of the reasons why we want to understand typical development, and maybe I shouldn't have used that term normal development, but at what age do children typically do things? Newborns are really helpless. They can't hold their head up. They can't do anything. And by about 2 months, 3 months, they're starting to hold their head up, push themselves up. They might even be able to roll over. They might be able to sit with support. They might actually be able to grab stuff. And then sitting without support's around 6 months or so. And then after they've sat for a while, most babies crawl and then they start pulling themselves up on furniture and things like that. But there are babies that don't crawl before they walk. Typically, the crawling does occur before walking, but maybe if a child didn't have that opportunity to explore while crawling, they might go directly to the walking stage. And then, of course, when they first start to walk, they're a little bit wobbly, and they get better and better as they practice that. And then we look at fine motor skills, picking up things, walking up steps, more complicated physical movements. So these are developmental milestones that we look at when we're trying to decide if a child is developing in a normal physical way. So this is what we're going to talk about in this chapter. First thing we're going to talk about are biological contributions to development. We'll talk a little bit about genetics and our chromosomes and how this determines a lot of our development. Then we're going to talk a little bit about developmental disabilities and how they occur, and other disorders like autism and attention deficit disorder that occur in childhood. We'll talk about in the next video, I think, maybe not the next one, but we'll talk about cognitive development and Piaget's theories about how our thought processes develop. And then we'll talk about psychosocial development. How do we develop in a social way, in a psychological way? How are we different at different ages in our psychological development and our social development. And we'll talk about attachment theory. We'll talk about some parenting skills, not so much skills, but parenting styles, I guess is what we talk about. And then we'll also talk about death and dying at the end of life. So one of the major controversies in development is, how much of who we are, how much of our development has to do with nature, what we're born with, and how much has to do with our environment. And in a development, it's a lot of both. Psychologists believe that both are equally important, and it's the interaction between the environment and our genes that really determines who we become. So we have our chromosomes are kind of what determines our genes and our genetics. So we have a set of 23 chromosomes from our mother, and then we get 23 chromosomes from our father. So we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, both from our mother and our father. And this is what it looks like if you ever have your chromosomes tested. It doesn't look like a whole lot, just little squiggly lines, but that's what it looks like. And the 23rd chromosome pair, which is this very last one here, is what determines whether or not you're a male or a female. So if you have two X chromosomes, you're a female. If you have an X and a Y, you're male. So this right here is an X and a Y chromosome, which is kind of doesn't really look like an X or a Y. Looks a little more like an X and a Y here, but it's not exactly an X and a Y. So our genes are found, all of our genetic code is found in our genes inside our chromosomes. And inside these chromosomes is where our DNA is. And that's really the blueprint of who we are. So every cell in our body, except for our red blood cells and like sex cells, so the sex cells, the sperm and the egg only contain half of our DNA or half of our chromosomes. But every other cell in our body contains a full set of 23 chromosome pairs that determines who we are. They contain our full genetic blueprint. And then each chromosome contains genes, and then DNA is contained within those genes. So it's very confusing. And if you think about it, these chromosomes are completely microscopic, and the DNA is even more microscopic inside of that. So the genes kind of determine who we are. DNA is really a blueprint of who we are, and we have approximately 20 to 30,000 genes, and within that we have DNA, which is amazing. So what can we learn from our DNA? So we have 3 million base pairs of genes within our chromosomes. You don't have to remember that number, but that's an amazing number. And different traits or even problems or disorders are linked to hundreds and possibly thousands of genes. So that's one of the difficulties. Somebody had mentioned early on about different sexual orientations and why can't we identify a gene? Well, the trouble is there's probably hundreds of genes that may or may not determine sexual orientation. We've done all sorts of research with people with obesity, trying to find is there an obesity gene. We also look at addiction genes, and we haven't been able to find them. The only case we've been pretty successful for so far is Alzheimer's, for early onset Alzheimer's, so not even late onset Alzheimer's. But early onset Alzheimer's, we have been able to identify many of the genes involved, but there's a couple hundred of them. So it's a really complex process. So the idea of being able to identify a gene that determines your eye color or your hair color is more complex than you might ever realize. We used to think that eye color was pretty simple, and now we're thinking there's at least 15 genes that contribute to eye color, rather than just the 3 or 4 I think that we used to talk about. And if you think about it, people that have, say, blue eyes, there's many different shades of blue eyes. There's many different shades of brown eyes as well. So it makes sense that just because you have brown eyes, there's a whole wide range of genes that might contribute to that color. So that's what we call polygenic, is that it's determined by many genes, not just one pair of genes, not just 2 pair of genes, but a lot of genes. So it really makes it difficult to identify the large number of genes associated with a particular trait or disorder. There's huge amounts of research being done in genetics, and it's pretty exciting that all the things that we are learning, and eventually maybe we will be able to determine a lot of these things, but it's just fascinating how much of who we are is determined by our genes, and how much we're learning about what what our genes actually determine. They're actually talking about personality traits. They've actually found that things like shyness and introversion and extroversion are actually maybe part of our genetic code. So if you're a shy person, it's not because you're defective in any way. It's just that you were born with that particular gene. So it's really interesting. I would think that personality traits would be much more environmentally influenced and much more like a personal choice, but that's not necessarily the case. So I wanted to talk a little bit about DNA and criminal profiling just because I think it's kind of fascinating. And also, I want people to really understand that it's a pretty new science, and really being able to see this genetic code, this DNA code, is new. And there's just making tons of advances all the time about how we can use this information, and it will also be something that we can use in psychology as well. So DNA was discovered in 1984 by a geneticist in Great Britain, and their goal was to try to determine who the father was of a particular baby, because there were a lot of paternity cases and lawsuits saying this is your baby, but there was no way to prove that. So the first case, the first time it was used was in 1984 is when it was discovered. The first criminal case to use DNA evidence was in 1986. So you're talking 25 years ago, and 1987 in the US. So it's pretty young science. So genotyping became available in the 1990s, where we could actually use it for familial DNA, so you could like ancestries and things like that. And it's become more and more accessible now because it costs less money. And so a lot of people are learning a whole lot of family secrets that they didn't know about before. They said there's some kind of a website on like Facebook or something where people are talking about, the trauma of finding out that their dad isn't really their dad, and some other really interesting stuff. So CODIS is the DNA database that they use for criminals. That was just established in 1990, and of course it wasn't great when it was first established. Now it is pretty comprehensive. People that are arrested and charged with a crime will have their DNA tested and put into CODIS, I believe. I'm not sure about all the rules about that. But we used to have a really good sample of DNA in order to test it. And now in 1993, they came up with a process of multiplying that DNA so that we could actually test even smaller samples. And so it's gotten better and better as time has gone. And in 2001, they've been able to figure out race, physical characteristics from DNA evidence. So that's pretty amazing that if you can find a drop of blood at a crime scene and you can actually tell what that person kind of looks like, maybe not perfectly, but you have a pretty good description of what that person looks like. So that's pretty amazing as well. And then they're also using familial DNA to identify perpetrators. So they're looking at all these ancestry databases that most people use to find, long lost relatives. They're actually looking at, can we match this particular DNA that we found at a crime scene to somebody in this database, and then they track down who could possibly be the perpetrator. So it's pretty fascinating that we're able to do that. So it's a really young science. So how much do our genes and our biology actually determine who we are? Is gender 100%? That's a really big question. What about people who are transgender? Is it genetic? We don't really know the answer to that question yet. We do know that there probably is a genetic component. We also know that hormones that an infant or a fetus is exposed to during pregnancy in the womb can actually affect your gender identity. So it's not really 100%, but we don't really know we're still researching. How about IQ, your intelligence level? It's about 50%. And if you think about it, if you have brothers and sisters, you probably could imagine that some of them have different IQs. Some of them are smarter than others, right? And then what about genetic disorders, things like Down syndrome that can happen? And it definitely makes a huge impact on who we are. And then what about psychological disorders, schizophrenia, depression, anxiety? We do believe that there is definitely a genetic component to psychological disorders. So truly, in all aspects of who we are, there's a genetic component and an environmental component. And I mentioned earlier about personality traits. I mean, that is just kind of crazy to think that much of our personality is actually sort of predetermined already. And if you have been around babies at all, multiple babies, you know that babies do seem to have a different personality, right? So babies are born with a certain temperament, and that temperament certainly affects how people respond to them, right? So many babies are very easygoing and easy to deal with, and of course they get lots of cute attention because they're adorable. And then we have our cranky babies, our temperamental babies, that just need a little more attention, get upset more easily, and that's something we're born with, or it appears to be something that we're born with. So they're saying today that they think 40% of our personality is attributed to genetics, and the rest is environmental. Kind of amazing. So that is it on genetics and biology, and I'll look forward to talking to you in the next video.